The Return of Sherlock Holmes. The Six Napoleons. Sherlock Holmes and I were often visited in the evenings by a detective from Scotland Yard named Mr. Lestrade. Mr. Holmes liked these visits because he was able to learn more about facts of Scotland Yard. This was London's most important police station. Holmes was known as an excellent detective, so Mr. Lestrade liked the visits too, often asking for advice. Holmes was always able to give useful advice once he listened carefully to the facts that Lestrade would give about the case. One evening, as Lestrade was visiting, he stopped their boring conversation they had been having about weather and nothing in particular. There was a silence for a few minutes. Finally, Holmes asked, "You have an interesting case for me this evening?" "Not really," Lestrade answered. "It isn't very interesting. It isn't that important. I know you like the more complicated cases, and this one is simple. I think Mr. Watson would be more interested than you." I was surprised. Normally it is Holmes that manages all the cases. It is his specialty. I am just a doctor and not a detective. "What's the problem?" I said. "Is someone ill?" "Well, not physically ill," Lestrade said. "I think the person is completely mad." "I don't understand," I said. "Please explain." "Well, someone is stealing cheap busts of Napoleon and throwing them to the ground to break them. I think he must hate Napoleon. He went into a shop 4 days ago, and when the shop assistant's back was turned, he stole a bust and ran out the door with it. It is a shop on Kennington Road, and the owner's name is Morse Hudson. The madman threw the bust on the ground outside and ran away. No one was able to identify him." Holmes was curious, I could see, and asked, "Why are you so interested in this?" "Well, it is not the only time this has happened," Lestrade said. "Yesterday it occurred again. This person broke into a house, this time a doctor's home named Barnicot. This doctor studies Napoleon and bought 2 of the busts of Morse Hudson's. He lives near the shop, and put one in his home and the other in his office, 2 miles away. When Dr. Barnicot woke up yesterday morning, he found the bust missing from his home, and found it outside where it had been thrown against the garden wall, broken into pieces. About noon he went to his office and found that bust also broken with pieces all over the room." "Were the 2 busts just alike?" Holmes asked. "This is getting more and more interesting. Both were exactly the same," Lestrade said. "Why would this person choose these 3 busts?" Holmes thought out loud. "I am sure there are lots of these types of busts in London. What is special about them? I don't think he is interested in Napoleon. I think it is the busts." "I am not sure," said Lestrade. "It is a possibility, but how can we know exactly? This is the only shop in this part of London that sells these busts. Maybe the thief lives nearby and started with these busts. Dr. Watson, do you think that someone could hate Napoleon that much to do these mad things?" "I guess it is a possibility," I said. "I know of several cases in the history of medicine that are similar, but I am curious how the madman knew where these three busts were located. The next morning, as I was dressing, Holmes came to see me. Lestrade Inn is in Kensington, and asked for us to come the right away, he said. We had a quick cup of coffee and left immediately. The house was not far from London Centre. It was in a quiet area, but that morning there was a big group of people standing outside. We could see Lestrade standing in front of the house when we came nearer. He looked very serious, and we could see a lot of blood in front of the door outside. As we pushed through the crowd and approached the front door, Lestrade invited us inside. We met Horace Harker, the owner of the house. He was a journalist for the London newspaper, and he was excited about the story of the events that had just happened. He told us he was too frightened to write about it at that time. Mr. Harker, Lestrade said, would you be so kind to tell this gentleman what happened as you know it? Certainly, he started. About 3 o'clock this morning, I was asleep and was awakened by a loud cry. I was afraid, but knew I had to investigate. I went downstairs and found the window to my study open, but no one in the room. I then noticed that the bust of Napoleon was missing. I opened the front door to find a policeman and saw a dead man lying there with blood all over him. And who is the dead man? Holmes asked. That's a good question, Lestrade said. We don't know, but he had a street map of London in his pocket, and a picture of this ugly man. There was also a knife lying beside him, but I am not sure if that was the murder weapon or not. And the bust of Napoleon? Holmes asked. It was found in a garden nearby of a house that is empty, broken like the others. We then went to look at the bust, leaving Mr. Harker at home. He wanted to write the article since he was feeling better. He found pieces of the bust by the garden wall at the empty house. Holmes examined some of the pieces carefully. Do you see anything, Holmes? Lestrade asked. Not at the moment, Holmes said. There are so many unanswered questions here. For example, why would someone want a cheap bust of Napoleon enough to kill a person? Also, why not just break it at the house? Why bring it all the way here? Lestrade thought about it for a minute and said, maybe he needed to be quiet and not let Mr. Harker hear him. Yes, I agree, this is possible, but why this house and not another? Holmes answered. This house was empty. No one could hear him, Lestrade said. There is another empty house closer on this road. Why not break it there? Holmes replied. Look above us. There is a street light here. Maybe the other house was too dark to see. How would that help us? Asked Lestrade. I am not sure at the moment, said Holmes. I must think about it for a while. What will you do now, Lestrade? I have to find out who the dead man is and why he was here last night. I think once I find that out, I will know who the killer is. What do you think? He answered. That isn't my way, But maybe you are right, said Holmes. Then what are you going to do now? asked Lestrade. I will do things my way. And you do things your way, and we will meet later. Then we will talk, said Holmes. One more thing. If you see Mr. Harker, please tell him that there was a dangerous Napoleon-hating madman in his house last night. So you really think that, Holmes? Lestrade asked, surprised. Not really, he said, laughing, but it will make a great story for the reader. I would like to keep this photo of the dead man if possible. Please come to our rooms on Baker Street at 6 o'clock this evening. After you arrive, we will go somewhere together. We were told that Mr. Harker's bust came from a shop on High Street called Harding Brothers. We went to see Mr. Harding, but he was not there when we arrived. We will come back later, Mr. Watson, Holmes said, disappointed. Now we can go visit Mr. Morse Hudson's shop. That is where Dr. Barnicot bought his busts. When we arrived and questioned Mr. Hudson, he was not happy about the broken busts. He gave us some information about them. They were made at Gilder and Company, on the other side of London. That is all I know. Holmes then took out the picture of the dead man and showed him. Do you know this man? Why, yes, Hudson answered. That's Beppo. He is an Italian man who worked here in my shop for a short time. He was a good worker, but left last week without telling me. We left the shop, and Holmes was pleased with the information we received. We then went to where the busts were made at Gilder and Company. It took us a while to get there. We had to pass through different parts of London, rich and poor areas. We finally got the area called Stepney. It was rich in the past, but things had changed. It was now a working area of the poor, and many of the people came from other countries. Finally, we found Gilder and Company. There was a German man there whom we talked to. We made hundreds of busts in the past, but this year we made only 6. We sold the 3 to Mr. Hudson and 3 to Mr. Harding. They weren't expensive busts. They were made by some Italian man. Holmes showed the picture to the man. That's Beppo, he said, getting red in the face. He is a terrible man. He worked here, but it has been over a year. Why do you say he is a terrible man? Holmes asked. He tried to kill a man with a knife. The police found him here and caught him. The man didn't die, so they only sent Beppo to prison for 1 year. He has a friend that works here now. Do you want to speak with him? If you would please not say anything to him at this time, Holmes said. It is very important to keep this quiet. One final question, Holmes began. In your book here, it says the busts were sold on June 3rd of last year. Can you remember what day the police came for Beppo? Yes, I do remember. They came a few days after May 20th. I remember because that was the last day I paid Beppo. This is very helpful information. Thank you very much for your time, and please remember not to say anything of this to Beppo's friend, he said as we left together. Since we hadn't eaten, we decided to stop At a restaurant, Holmes bought a newspaper to see if there was an article by Mr. Harker about the murder at his house. He was excited to find something, and after he read it, he laughed. "This story is mostly wrong, but it will be helpful," he said. I didn't understand, but said nothing. I laughed myself because it was a very silly story. When we finished eating, we decided to go back to Harden Brothers. Luckily, Mr. Harden was there this time, but was very busy and answered our questions as he continued to work. We found out that one of the busts was sold to Mr. Harker of Kensington, one to Mr. Josiah Brown of Chiswick, and the third to Mr. Sanderford of Reading, outside of London. After hearing this, we hurried back to Baker Street, as it was getting close to 6 o'clock, and we were supposed to meet Lestrade. Lestrade was there when we arrived. He was a little early and was very excited. "I have someone interesting information, Holmes," he said. "What about you? Did you find anything today?" "We learned something about the busts and who bought them all," Holmes said. "Is that all?" Lestrade said, laughing. "I have found out things more important than just the busts." "Is that so?" Holmes said. "What exactly are you talking about?" "I have the identity of the dead man, and I believe I also have the motive for the murder," Lestrade said, smiling. "That is excellent," Holmes said. "Do tell us." "Well," Lestrade began, "one of our detectives of Scotland Yard knows a lot of the Italians in London. He knew of this man and said his name was Pietro Vinici. Vinici worked for the Mafia and was known to be a dangerous man and also a thief. His job was to kill people who didn't follow the instruction of the Mafia. Apparently, the murdered man broke the rules and Vinici was sent to kill him. But they had a fight and Vinici lost and did himself." "I understand," Holmes said, "but why do you think the busts were broken?" "Those busts are not important to this case," Lestrade said, raising his voice. "You need to forget about them, Holmes. Breaking a bust will only get a 6-month prison term, but Pietro Vinici is dead. That is what is important here." "I see," said Holmes. "So what is the next step?" "I'm going to the area where all the Italians live and find the man in the photograph. Do you want to come along?" he said. "I don't think so," said Holmes. "I believe we can find him somewhere else." "Really? Where?" Lestrade asked. "If you come with me tonight, I will show you. It is at an address in Chiswick. If we don't find him, I will come with you tomorrow night," Holmes said. Lestrade agreed, and we went for an early dinner. After dinner, Holmes told Lestrade to rest until 11 o'clock. He did not sleep at all. He sat and read the newspapers. I thought he was probably looking for facts about Beppo or Vinici. At 10:30 we got up and Holmes was waiting for us. He had his favorite walking stick with him. He asked me to bring my gun. We got a carriage and went to Chiswick to a big house on a dark street. There were no lights on at the house, so the people inside were probably sleeping, I thought. "We have to be very quiet," said Holmes. "I am happy it isn't raining. We may have to wait a while, and we can't make any noise or smoke. I am hoping that we will discover something tonight here." Suddenly, the gate to the garden opened, and we saw a man run quickly through towards the house. None of us could see his face because it was so dark, so all we could do was wait. We were very quiet and heard the sound of the window opening. Then we saw a small light in the front of the house. "Come on," Lestrade said. "Let's go to that window he opened and wait. We can catch him when he tries to leave." Just as we were getting ready to go, the man came out carrying something in his arms. He ran to the wall, looked around, and threw the object. There was a loud crash when it broke with pieces flying nearby. We all ran to the place, and Holmes jumping on the man's back, with both falling heavily to the ground. I had my gun ready and pointing it at the man. Lestrade told him to stop. We finally had our prisoner. The man's face was very ugly, and he was angry. You could see he was the same man in the photograph we had. Holmes began to look at the pieces that were broken of the object the man had thrown against the wall, and saw that it was another Napoleon bust. This is exactly what he expected. He examined each piece, holding it up to the light. Just then a light came on in the house, and a short, fat man came out. He came to us and said, "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes, right?" "I am," Holmes answered. "I supposed you are Mr. Josiah Brown." "Yes, that's right, and I did just as you instructed my man servant earlier today," he answered. We turned off the lights, locked the door, and waited very quietly. "Will you please come in and have something to eat and drink now?" "Maybe another time," Holmes said. "Mr. Lestrade must take the prisoner to Scotland Yard now." On the way we all rode together, but the prisoner said nothing. He was ugly and still angry. Once at Scotland Yard he was searched, and the police found a long knife with blood on it and a little money. "Well," Lestrade said, "I thank you for your help, Mr. Holmes. Do you now think I was right with my idea?" "I still think the busts are important," Holmes said. "I have some more things to do. Will you come again to my rooms at 6 o'clock tomorrow?" "I would love to," Lestrade said. "See you tomorrow." On the way home, Holmes said, "Lestrade is a good detective, but he doesn't understand everything about this case. There is more to it than we can see." "What more is there?" I asked. I know the busts are the most important part of this case. I just have to find out why," he said. The next evening, Lestrade arrived at 6 o'clock as planned. He had learned more about people. He found out that he spent time in prison as a famous thief and had stabbed a man with a knife. We already know this information. Lestrade also said that Beppo was very good at making busts and other types of art. He thought it was possible that he made the Napoleon busts at Gilder and Company. Holmes listened carefully, but said nothing. He was smiling. A few minutes later there was a knock at the door. An old man carrying a large bag came into the room and put the bag on the table. "Are you Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he said. "Yes, I am," Holmes said. "I supposed you are Mr. Sandford of Reading. Thank you for coming. This is Mr. Lestrade from Scotland Yard, and my good friends Dr. Watson." "Nice to meet you," Mr. Sandford said. "Here is the bust of Napoleon you asked me to bring after I received your letter, Mr. Holmes." The day before, Holmes had written a letter to Mr. Sandford asking for him to bring the bust to Baker Street. He offered in the letter to pay £10 for the bust. Mr. Sandford said, "I didn't pay that much for this bust, Mr. Holmes. I believe you should know that I only paid £1 for it. If you don't want to buy it now, I will understand. That's a big difference in price." "Here's the £10, Holmes said, smiling. "I still want it." Mr. Sandford said, "Suit yourself," and took the money. He opened the bag and took out the Napoleon bust just like the others. "Please," Holmes said, "before you leave, would you just sign this paper saying I bought the bust for £10? Mr. Sandford signed the paper and left. After he closed the door, Holmes took a clean white cloth and laid it on the table. He put the bust on top of the cloth. He then took his walking stick and hit the head. It broke into a lot of small pieces. Holmes laughed. "Just as I thought," he said. He picked up a small black cloth from the pieces. It's the black pearl of Burgess," he said. Lestrade and I were amazed, and he said, "How did you know? That's not possible." "It is." Holmes smiled and said, "Yes, it is possible. This is the most famous pearl in the world. It belongs to the Princess of Colonna. It was stolen from her hotel room last year on May 22. Don't you remember when that happened, Lestrade?" "Of course I remember. But how did you know that it was that pearl?" he questioned. "I thought this because her hotel was at the same part of London as Gilder and Company. It was also thought that the thief was an Italian waitress that worked at the hotel. Her name was Lucrezia Venucci. They could never prove it. It was her brother that was killed 2 nights ago, Pietro. I always saw in the newspapers that Beppo was caught only 2 days after the pearl was stolen. We were told that the Napoleon busts were made during those 2 days. I don't know who stole the pearl. Perhaps Venucci took it and Beppo stole it from him. It doesn't really matter," Holmes continued. "What I do know for sure is that on the night of Beppo's street fight, he had the pearl when he ran away, and the police followed. He had to hide it, so he went to Gilder's and put it inside one of the busts. They had just been made and were still soft. He pushed the pearl into one and covered the hole. No one would think to look there. When Beppo was in prison that year from the street fight, the 6 busts were sold. So when Beppo got out, he got a job with Morse Hudson to find the names of the buyers of the busts. Then he started his search for the correct bust to find the hidden pearl. After he broke the first bust, he then went to Dr. Barnicot's busts. He still didn't find the pearl after breaking those 3. The other 3 busts were sold to Mr. Harden for his shop. I don't know how people found out who had bought the busts from there. Maybe he had an Italian friend to help him. During this time, Venucci had heard Beppo was out of prison and started to look for him. He followed Beppo to Mr. Harker's house because he knew that Beppo was searching for the pearl. A fight happened and Venucci was killed. But if Beppo and Venucci know each other, why did Venucci carry a photograph of Beppo? I asked. To show people in order to find Beppo, Holmes said. At first, I wasn't sure if Beppo had found the pearl or not at Harker's. But I know that if he didn't, there were only two more busts that he could find it in, one in Chiswick and the other in Reading. Since Chiswick is closer than Reading, I asked Josiah Brown to prepare himself for a break-in. Just as I thought, people went to the Browns for the bust. When we caught him and there was no pearl, I knew it had to be in Mr. Sandford's bust, Holmes said, smiling. He continued, since the article in the newspaper was written, everyone, including the police, was looking for a Napoleon-hating crazy man. People must have read it and thought no one knew the truth. When I heard the name Venucci, I remembered the robbery of the pearl and knew then what had happened. Lestrade had been listening carefully and finally said, Holmes, this is one of your best. I know my friends at Scotland Yard will be very interested in hearing it. Can you come tomorrow and explain how you solved this case? I would be happy to, Holmes said. Thank you again, Lestrade said. I can't begin to tell you how much you have helped me, and you have also found the famous black pearl. Holmes just smiled, and then looked at me and said, Well, Watson, we had better go. We have more cases to solve. We need to get to work. Lestrade, if you have any more need of my assistance, please tell me. I am always delighted to help if I can.